Hi, everyone. This is Matt Trokin. I hope you're all doing well wherever you may be. And really, I wanted to kind of reflect first upon the end of last school year, which, of course, presented probably some of the greatest challenges we've ever faced as educators. And during those waning days of the 2019-20 school year, I got into thinking about a topic that I think is very important, particularly for teachers of US2, which is getting to the present. And I think, during my first few years teaching US2, I never really quite got there. In fact, I'd kind of finished somewhere around the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I really thought about that during my last years in the classroom. And I said, that's not really so great in the sense that most of my students, their parents are probably born 10 years or more after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, for many of them, U.S. history too at this high school could very well be the last history course that they take. So I really felt that it was important that we get students content-wise as much to the present as we possibly can so that they can make sense of the world in which they live. So really I wanted to kind of take a look at a couple of different frameworks for the teaching of some of those later chronological units of study in US2, and certainly kind of think about how we could develop both a greater level of efficiency in terms of the content that is covered, but also to create more in-depth and thematic connections for students that really cause them to think more critically about the phenomenon that they study in our classes. So that being said, just to kind of look at, the importance of content connections, and I made there's a Cuban Missile Crisis comic right there. Had to make that connection myself again. But, certainly looking at content connections and efficiency in the later portions of the US2 curriculum, really I got into thinking about a few years ago. I had a student teacher, and once he got into his stride, I was able to really kind of think about something that had been bothering me for a long time with US2, which was the fact that I never really seemed to get quite up to speed to the present. And so I'll share with you in a moment a memo from John F. Kennedy's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, where he really hammers home very succinctly the connections that exist or existed between foreign policy and domestic policy during the Cold War era. And I think really kind of helped me to kind of provide students with a framework whereby they were, being forced to really think more critically about both domestic policy and foreign policy events. So really by doing this, by identifying thematic parallels and connections, you're going to be, in essence, deepening students' understandings about the interconnectedness of historical events and phenomena. And I think, certainly developing a certain vision for the teaching of Cold War era history and history post-Cold War. And I think, certainly the way that many of the secondary sources out there kind of frame things, particularly if you look at textbooks, you'll see that there's very often this linear division between foreign policy and domestic policy post-World War II. So just to take a look at some of the books that we have that we use with students, the American History book by HMH, you could see here, the Cold War, all foreign policy events, then you get a series of domestic policy events, and you kind of have that back and forth, but you don't really have a clearly connected framework whereby you have both foreign policy and domestic policy events taught in tandem, taught together, the connections that exist between them being developed and established for students. Certainly you don't see that there in the table of contents. You look at it, it's very much the same thing. If you look at the Americans textbook, you see the way that that is outlined and laid out there for you. Very much the same in the sense of having a linear division between domestic policy and foreign policy, and you see once again a similar type of framework. Domestic policy on one side, foreign policy on the other. In the United States History and New Jersey edition book, the orange book that many of you use in US2. So certainly looking at some of our A and B level textbooks, you can see those linear divisions that exist in that particular framework. Now, Rusk's testimony that he gave before a Senate panel in 1963. It's succinct, and I'm going to share with you a snippet from that testimony that I think really hammered home the fact that both domestic policy and foreign policy were more connected than ever before, and more clearly than ever before. You could see those connections during the Cold War era. So I'm going to share with you a bit of what Dean Rust had to say back in 1963. So he says before the Senate panel, he says, "As matters stand, racial discrimination here at home has important effects on our foreign relations. This is not because such discrimination is unique to the United States. Discrimination on account of race, color, religion, national or tribal origin may be found in other countries. But the United States is widely regarded as the home of democracy and the leader of the struggle for freedom, human rights, for human dignity. We are expected to be the model. No higher compliment could be paid to us. So our failure to live up to our proclaimed ideals are noted and magnified and distorted. But in waging this world struggle, we are seriously handicapped by racial or religious discrimination in the United States. Our failure to live up to the pledges of our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution embarrasses our friends and heartens our enemies. In their efforts to enhance their influence among the non-white peoples and to alienate them from us, the communists clearly regard racial discrimination in the United States as one of their most valuable assets. If progress should stop, if Congress should not approve legislation designed to remove remaining discriminatory practices, questions would inevitably arise in many parts of the world as to the real convictions of the American people. In that event, hostile propaganda might be expected to hurt us more than it has hurt us until now." And I think, you listen to what Rusk is saying there. This is a portion of his testimony before that Senate panel, which the testimony itself was succinct in and of itself, but I provided you with just a snippet from it. He's really saying here that, if you're going to talk the talk about being this country that is supportive of democracy and of equal rights and of equality under the law and all of these wonderful things, you also have to walk the walk. And I think, really this particular testimony, as succinct as it is, I think can be used as a means by which to really introduce that concept to students of that interconnection that exists between foreign policy and domestic policy. The United States is this influential country in the world, claiming to be about democracy and freedom and equality. It needs to get its house in line. And I think, when you're bringing together foreign policy and domestic policy issues, it's certainly a good thing to explore those parallels, to make connections wherever you possibly can. And the connections, they can be, certainly indirect, but as long as you're making a connection between domestic and foreign policy, I think that it helps to create a greater level of efficiency, and it also helps to make students think more critically and to really examine historical phenomenon, not as events or instances or occurrences that happen in a bubble, but as things that are actually interconnected and interlinked. So certainly looking at a photo here of some members of the non-aligned movement, leaders in that movement in the Cold War era, certainly Nehru of India, Nkrumah of Ghana, Nasser of Egypt. You could see, kind of the importance of the United States in the global stage. This particular book, I did enjoy it. It's a series of different correspondences, essays, letters, things of that nature that really help to explore how Cold War foreign policy was connected very much to the domestic situation. So very often when looking at this era, I like to refer to it as the Cold War era, and not just simply the Cold War, because of course the importance of domestic policy. And so that being said, I think if you look at some of our own curriculum that we've developed, if you look at, for example, Unit 4.2 and 4.3, if you look at the unit overviews, if you look at the second sentence in the overview for 4.2, it says African Americans and other minority groups fought for equality within the American system as the United States emerged as a global superpower and the standard bearer of democracy. If you look at 4.3, the last sentence there, students will discern the Cold War's impact on civil liberties and civil rights as its contribution to a reshaping of American values and identity. So really the very fact of the matter that the United States is representing itself on the global stage as a counter to Soviet communism and of the authoritarianism that existed under that system, and is saying that it is the country that represents democracy and freedom and equality, I think it's something that creates a tremendous connection to a lot of the domestic social movements that were taking shape in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And I think wherever you can forge those connections, it does help to develop a greater level of not only efficiency with the presentation of the content, but it also helps to cause students to think more critically about how these instances and occurrences are connected and interlinked to one another. So just for example, my first few years teaching US2, I very often found myself finishing somewhere, as I said, somewhere around the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first year that I kind of implemented this, where I would teach Cold War domestic and foreign policy events side by side, hammering home the connections between them to students. It ended up being much more efficient, too. I ended up finishing with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By no means the present. The first time that I did that in 2014 or so, or whenever it was. But certainly much better than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And certainly, I think, provided students much greater service in the sense of helping them to really kind of get into an understanding of how we got to where we are now. And, certainly students, some of whom this could have been very well the last history course that they ever took was U.S. History 2 at the high school level. I think this is certainly something to keep in mind. So certainly we'll see in the subsequent missions means by which to develop greater efficiency with the presentation of the content, but also means by which to cause students to think more critically as well about the connections that exist between both foreign policy and domestic policy. And I think we're certainly advantaged with the longer 75-minute blocks. So I think that's certainly a good thing, and we'll continue with a few subsequent missions. Thank you, folks.